Right, everyone. So hello and welcome. And thank you for joining us today for our webinar titled Land in Hard Places, How Militarization, Conflict, and Political Transition Shape the Politics of Land. Today's webinar is the second in a series on land and social justice struggles that is being organized and co-produced by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center, also known as the IGDC at the University of York in the United Kingdom, and the Center for Asia in Africa, or CASA, at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. My name is Saba Joshi, and I'm the Deputy Director of the IGDC and a lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. And I'm co-chairing this event today with Professor Alf Gunvald Nilsen, who is Director of CASA and Professor in Sociology at the University of Pretoria. So the IGDC is an interdisciplinary research community for equitable global development based at the University of York. And our center brings together researchers from across the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences within the university and globally. Today, the IGDC is very pleased to be partnering with the Center for Asia and Africa at the University of Pretoria to produce this webinar series. And the Center for Asian Studies in Africa, or CASA for short, is a newly established hub for research in the field of Asian studies and studies of historical and contemporary Afro-Asian connections. So before I introduce our panel today, I'd just like to mention a couple of housekeeping points. This session is being recorded, but only the video and audio of the panelists and panelists will be recorded. Attendees' mics are muted and your video is off, so you won't be recorded. The only information that may be recorded is any questions that you type in, and that may include your name. So following the presentation by the three panelists, we'll have around 30 minutes for question and answers. And this part of the webinar will be led by my co-chair, Alf Nilsen. So to ask any questions, please click on the Q&A button at in the bottom bar. The panelists will answer questions submitted through that function. If you're having any technical issues, please use the chat function, and then you can talk to the host directly. So to ask questions, use the Q&A button, and any tech issues in the chat, please. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce the panel that is here to speak at our webinar today, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. So first we have Professor Alia Gana. Alia is a research professor at the Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. Her research is focused on the transformation of social forms of agricultural production, agricultural policies, and development models, including the management of water and land resources, alternative farming practices, and peasant collective action and protest movements in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Welcome, Alia. Second, we have Professor Bengt Karlsson, who is the Professor of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University. He works on issues relating to indigenous peoples and and the society-environment interface, with particular focus on the politics of ethnicity and nature in India. Lovely to have you here, Bengt. And then we have Eric Hoddy, Dr. Eric Hoddy, who is a lecturer and assistant professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. Eric's research interests are focused on climate and development, human rights and social movements, human rights leadership, and transitional and transformative justice. Thanks. Nice to have you here, Eric. So I think we'll invite our first speaker, who's Alia, to make her presentation to begin with. Alia, you have around 15 to 20 minutes to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to Saba for the invitation to take part in this webinar. My presentation will focus on land mobilization in Tunisia in the context of the political upheavals triggered by the 2011 Tunisian revolution. As you know, Tunisia is the pioneer country of the so-called Arab Spring, which, after starting in Tunisia in December 2010, spread to Egypt, Libya, Syria, with repercussion throughout North Africa and the Arab world. I'd like to begin by pointing out that the most common analysis of the Arab Spring have tended to emphasize the role of urban youth and social networks in triggering the uprisings, thus neglecting the mobilization of peasants and rural communities in crystallizing popular revolt against authoritarian regimes. And this seems not unrelated to the tendency in the literature on social mobilizations in the context of the Arab uprisings to adopt a dichotomous approach between protest movement of a social nature, bread and butter, and so-called mobilizations of a political nature. Indeed, this dichotomous approach has led some political scientists to characterize peasant movements either as non-social movements or to emphasize their eruptive, violent, and apolitical nature, or even to consider them likely to disrupt the political order and therefore of little interest for analysis. Yet, in both Tunisia and Egypt, the numerous mobilizations over access to land and agricultural resources that preceded and followed the popular uprisings of 2011 were far from sporadic, taking place over a long period of time and fundamentally assuming a political dimension. In both countries, they intensified after 2011 and often took new forms such as land occupations by landless or dispossessed peasants and agricultural workers. Here, it's important to recall that in Tunisia, contrary to Egypt, the popular uprising originated in rural and inland areas and later spread to the major cities of the country. After the overthrow of President Ben Ali, protest movements in rural and agricultural areas grew significantly and were characterized mainly by demands for better access to land and economic resources. In particular, claims on state-owned farmland have intensified, leading some political parties to lend their support to a project of agrarian reform that would improve access to land for smallholders and farm workers. In this presentation, I propose to explore mobilizations over state-owned agricultural land as a space of confrontation, legitimacy conflicts, social innovation, and reconfiguration of power relations between actors with divergent interests. Based on field research on mobilization for access to farmland, I would like first to highlight the social significance and political stakes of the movement of state land occupations, and second, to explore, in light of the Jemna experience, the processes that enabled the occupier of the Jemna state farm to establish a favorable balance of power in their confrontation with the state, and that enabled the association that carried their demands to establish its legitimacy at the local level and beyond. First, it's important to stress that the land occupation movement in post-2011 Tunisia reactivates a collective memory of land dispossession among rural communities of many regions. In the immediate aftermath of Ben Ali's flight, a number of state-owned farms managed by private companies were taken over by local residents and former farm workers to denounce the privatization of state-owned farms and to pressure the transitional government to redistribute state-owned land in their favor. These actions were often violent and of varying duration, and they affected more than 100 farms and several tens of thousands of hectares. They were in fact part of a revolt against the exactions of the former regime, against the stranglehold of families allied to the government on state lands, but above all, of a more general and sustained aspiration on the part of poor peasants and rural workers for recognition of their rights to access land and were therefore highly political. Indeed, since the late 80s, the transfer of the management of agricultural cooperatives to private companies has been met with resistance from former cooperative workers, many of whom have lost their jobs and sources of income in the privatization process. The transfer of state land to private investors has continued to be a source of much tension between peasants, farm workers, and private managers, and claims to state land have remained alive among poor peasants in many regions until the revolution, even if these claims have been rarely satisfied. Thus, the violence of the campaigns against several state farms was fueled by a feeling of injustice and dispossession generated by the exclusion of small farmers and farm workers from the process of privatization of state land management, and by popular resentment toward the private managers of state land, who were actually seen as new colonizers. For several years, many of the farms formerly managed by private companies have remained occupied by peasants and farm workers, demanding their return to the hands of the administration or their distribution to the family members formerly employed on these lands. To a large extent, the mobilization around state farms reflect the rise of a movement challenging state ownership of agricultural land. This has led peasants in several regions to demand the recovery of the land of their ancestors, first confiscated by French colonists and then nationalized by the state after independence. As a matter of fact, some families have taken steps to have their rights to state land recognized based on the presentation of ancient, that means pre-colonization titles. However, despite its magnitude, the land occupation movement, which was supported in some cases by left-wing parties and local committees for the defense of the revolution, failed to win the support of the main trade union organizations, the General Union of Tunisian Workers, UGTT, and the Tunisian Agriculture and Fisheries Union, UTAP. In general, the land occupation movement received very little media coverage and elicited a little reaction from the authorities, who actually adopted a wait-and-see attitude, despite the claim that the land occupation was illegal. It was only in 2016, with the emergence of the so-called Jemna case, that land occupations and the problems of the management of state-owned agricultural land were brought to light. Let me now recall the facts surrounding the Jemna case. The Jemna Palm Grove case, in January 2011, young people from Jemna, an oasis village in southern Tunisia, occupied a state-owned palm grove and expelled the managers who ran it as a private company. Their initial project was to divide the land among the occupiers. Shortly after the occupation of the palm grove, a group of teachers and activists of the Jemna town entered into discussions with the occupiers and came up with the idea of creating an association, the Association for the Protection and Sustainable Development of the Jemna Oasis, which then took over the management of the state farm without being really worried by the authorities for a 5-year period. However, in September 2016, the publication by the association of a tender for the sale of the date production crystallized and brought the conflict between the association and the authorities into the open. Nevertheless, in the face of the local and national mobilization in support of the association and of the solidarity expressed by various political parties with the cause of the Gemna collective, the authorities were forced to enter into negotiation to find a solution to the crisis that actually some authors have described or explained, analyzed as a conflict between legality and legitimacy. What then explains the ability of the Gemna farm occupiers to secure a favorable position in the balance of power that placed them in conflict with the administration, and the ability of the association to build its legitimacy? In practice, the legitimation of the occupation of the palm grove and of the action deployed by the association has been built around three axes. First, a narrative of dispossession and marginalization, and a moral discourse around corruption. I quote a leader of the association: "We did not take over the state's land, rather, we have reclaimed the land of our ancestors." The discourse thus emphasizes the emotional connection and ancestral attachment of the people of Gemna to the land. It is also accompanied by a narrative about the social and political marginalization of the Tunisian South. I quote, "Bourguiba and Ben Ali have always treated us, the people of the South, as enemies." Thus, the farm occupation is presented as an affirmation of historical rights to land, as a collective reparation for historical injustice, and as a moral act against the corruption represented by the previous private managers. The second axis of legitimation is the association's action in the service of the Gemna community and local development. The association's leaders emphasize the improvement of farm yields and incomes, the improvement of workers' salaries, and the increase in the number of employees, and above all, the use of profits to finance community infrastructure and social actions through subsidies to the municipality and to local associations. "We have replaced the state," the president of the association stated. The third key to Gemna's legitimacy lies in its ability to mobilize support and raise awareness among a broad public. This involves activating national and international networks composed of political actors, lawyers, intellectuals, NGOs, launching media campaigns using networks, social networks, press articles, publication by researchers and association, the production of films, and also co-organizing support events abroad with Tunisian diaspora associations and trade unions in France and other EU countries. All this mobilization and support have put strong pressure on the authorities, whose own position at that time were marked by conflicts and contradictions between different administrations. The pressure exerted on the authorities led to negotiations between the association and the administration. In fact, the association skillfully manipulated the political frictions within the political class, and finally, the management of the Gemna case was transferred from the Ministry of Land Affairs to the Ministry of Agriculture, which had a more favorable position toward the Gemna experience. In fact, the Ministry of Agriculture proposed a regulatory framework for the management of the palm grove, namely the creation of a farm cooperative to allow for profit-making activities. An agreement was reached between the association and the Ministry of Agriculture in October 2017. which provided for a transitional period during which the association would continue to manage the palm grove, pending the creation of a cooperative, which would follow the amendment of the text governing Tunisian cooperatives. This agreement illustrates the evolution of the attitude of the public authorities towards the experience of the Gemna farm, which is actually now presented as an experience to be in the service of the social and solidarity economy. However, after a transitional period of 2.5 years, the association informed the Ministry of Agriculture that it was no longer interested in creating a cooperative. In any case, after 13 years of occupation of the state farm, the Gemna Association, thanks to the support it benefited from and its ability to play on the conflicts within the political class, has managed to maintain the statu quo, even if its initial position, the claim to ownership of the land, seems to have evolved. As a result, it continues to operate the palm grove and distribute its income without worrying and without having to pay a rent to the state domain. In conclusion, the mobilizations for access to land resource and land occupations have undoubtedly reactivated a collective memory of dispossession that has remained alive among a peasantry that has borne the full impact of privatization and liberalization policies. Land mobilizations have helped to put the issue of rural inequalities back on the agenda, as well as the debate on agrarian reform, which was thought to have fallen by the wayside. Another important lesson to be learned concerns the transformation of the frameworks of collective action away from the trade unions, which have shown little capacity to support land-related demands. With this regard, the experience of associative management of the Gemna farm and the dynamics it has generated undoubtedly illustrate the emergence of a civil society that has been trying to position itself in the spaces opened up by the post-2011 political upheavals, in particular as a relay of public action and a framework for collective action. Another general lesson that can be drawn from the Gemna experience, which has been presented in recent works as the only success story of the Tunisian revolution, concerns the normative frameworks and reference models that inspire and legitimize the actions of the Gemna Association. It consists in drawing on such distant registers as human rights, the historical community of belonging and local identity, or the model of the social and solidarity economy, all references that can prove to be contradictory in practice and limit the transformative scope of the experience. But this is another story. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alia. I think we have Bengt who will be speaking next.
Okay, thanks. Let me just try to share my screen to get this. Okay, thanks a lot. Well, are we ready to delve into a completely different context? I hope we can. So anyway, thanks for inviting me to take part in this important webinar on sort of emerging issues relating to the politics of land in conflict context. So I will take you to the part of the world where I've been based. We've been working the last 30 years or so. And this is the region known as Northeast India. And this is where I've been sort of working on land issues or struggles about ethnic homelands and rights to land and natural resources, and usually in relation to various types of indigeneity associations, that we are indigenous and hence we have right to these lands. So so I have uploaded this image just for you to see where we are in the world. You see the green area is Northeast India. And on the right side, you see another map by James Scott. I'll be coming back to that in a while. Anyway, so yeah, I think, we heard from the previous presentation, land issues are extremely complex. And I think, every place is complex, but I think I could sort of argue with certain right to say that Northeast India is endlessly complex. This is a place for several hundred different ethnic communities, particularly in the hill areas where I've been working. There are different languages, histories, and not least different types of traditional land owning systems. And the colonial and the post-colonial period have had rather complicated consequences for how borders and boundaries are being drawn, as well as how people have been categorized and how they identify themselves, and as well as the land they claim. Land they claim as their ancestral homelands. So the post-colonial period, not least in the 1990s, have seen a large number of violent armed struggles for independence or self-determination, with widespread atrocities, various types of human rights violations carried out by the armed forces and the paramilitary, as well as by ethnic militias. The Naga nationalist movement, I suppose, is the most well-known example, starting already in the late 1950s, going on. And I think now it's under a peace agreement, so there's been no sort of armed conflicts the last 10 years or so. But there are various other, a large number of different conflicts that are sort of settled or in the process of being settled, various types of peace accords. But there are also new conflicts emerging, and this is something we saw in the state of Manipur during last year, when you had huge conflicts between the Métis community in the valley and one of the indigenous communities in the hills, the Kuki. And this is really around land issues, you might say, and about ethnic homelands and about being indigenous. So I've been mainly working in hill areas. And I think it's one of the sort of simple ways to think about this region is to use, James Scott's notion of Somia, development from Willem van Schendel's earlier ideas. So it's a kind of a hill valley dynamic where, as Scott suggests, people in the hills been trying to sort of keep the states in the valley at arm's length, trying to sort of govern themselves. And one way to do that is to prevent the state from sort of taxing people in the hills and to climb the hill and take possession. And I think the agriculture system, then Scott is arguing that people have been taking up shifting cultivation as a form of agriculture where the state has much more difficult to tax people, because if you have a shifting cultivation land, the different crops, emerging at different points of time, and it's very difficult to come in and just claim part of the harvest as tax. And I think still in the hill areas, shifting cultivation or June cultivation, as is known, is still practiced. And I think this is a very important, because when we think about land conflicts today, because when you do shifting cultivation, as I suppose most of you know, you use the land for 1 or 2 or 3 seasons or so, and then you let go of the land. And I think earlier on, it was really sort of land was not a problem as such. It was more labor that was in short time. So there was no point for anyone to claim land longer than you were actually using it. And at that time, earlier, every family had access to land. It was sort of community land that was distributed annually to families. But what has happened since basically the colonial period, because again, the British was pushing for this, so land has increasingly been turned into commodities or privately held or owned. And today we have a situation in many parts of the hill areas of Northeast where you have more than 50% of the farmers having no access to land. And this process of land privatization has been really sort of driven by conflicts over natural resources. So where you had, say, forest, you had timber, you had coal, you had uranium, oil, tea, or hydropower, people have been claiming that land to get compensation and to harvest the resource you had in that place. So I think, I'm sort of entitled this talk, the land and the new oil palm frontier in Northeast India. And I think it is useful to think about this part of India as a resource frontier and as a place that is not yet settled, as Anna Singh so aptly put it. So different empowered actors, different legal systems, and different modes of land use compete and are involved in claiming rights to land and resources. And all this happens in a political context marked by ethnic homeland struggles, where the focus is to keep various unwanted outsiders out of the land. And these outsiders are, people from the Indian mainland. These are people from the other side of the international border, people from Bangladesh, but also people from other ethnic communities in the hills and in the plains. And of course, adding to that, you have a lot of overlapping territorial claims where you have sort of different ethnic communities claiming certain parts of the land as ancestral homelands, and these are sometimes overlapping, which again produces a lot of violence and conflict between communities, not only between land and state and community, but also within communities. And as the focus being really sort of the regional politics since the independence, more or less, has been to keep outsiders out and to claim ethnic homelands, this has allowed for the indigenous elites to take advantage and claim large chunks of lands for themselves. Because again, focus has been really on outsiders and then, with various protective legal instruments and also through political movements, keeping outsiders out. It has allowed for the political and economic elite to claim huge huge tracts of land. Land that were earlier used by communities or clans. So in the state of Meghalaya, where I've been mainly been working, this process of land concentration with the elite has gone hand in hand with increasing conflicts about indigenous membership. So again, it also sort of turned inwards and say, who are the true indigenous here? So if you have, for example, a situation where you have an interethnic marriage, will the offspring be considered to be a full clan member and hence have rights to land? And I think particularly in the context, again, of Meghalaya, that the communities have all a matrilineal kinship system where it is actually the youngest daughter who is supposed to inherit land. And among the elite groups, they haven't sort of always had problem with that. So because again, it's male political leadership. So they've also tried to change that system so that it shouldn't go via the female line, but rather to the man's side. So as land rights remain disputed, claimed by those with political clout or muscle power, has been a rather, they've been really, such claim has been sort of leading to a very ruthless form of exploitation of natural resources. So there's been a sort of an extractive regime in place where people are trying to grab the resources as fast as possible, and without really concerns about, the environment and neither about, the social welfare of some of the people involved in the extraction. So, coal extraction has been sort of the really case in point. They use a method called rat hole mining, where there's common a lot of disasters where people are trapped inside these rat holes and dying in there. And also the mining has caused numerous environmental problems. But so this has been really unraveling in a quite sort of nasty way. But at the same time, we also have a lot of different groups and movements around in the region where people try to question this sort of violent form of a resource extraction and instead seek to, inhabit or propose another way of inhabiting the land, which is sort of based a more responsible way that is based on sort of indigenous principles of care and responsibility for the land. And this is something I've been looking into with a number of Indian colleagues under the rubric of food sovereignty. So these are movements centered on how the crops you're planting and the indigenous food systems where you sort of metabolically ground yourself on the land. So this is sort of a dynamic that I and other people have been looking at for the last couple of decades. So this is rather well known, but I would like to sort of take you now into sort of what I think to be a kind of new dynamic at play that's still is less clear. And it's sort of what I'm proposing now is a little bit of more speculative thinking, perhaps. But India, as many of you know, is presently going through a general election where we all are concerned about, the outcome, where I suppose most analysts suggest that the BJP, the present government with Modi, the prime minister, will probably be re-elected and remain in power for his third consecutive period. And I think this is something that is problematic, I would say, in many ways. But BJP's, even before, the previous two elections, the BJP's electoral success in this part of the country has been sort of really kind of a game changer and quite surprising, to be honest, because this is, particularly in the hill areas, you have people that are mainly, Christian, and you also have a lot of sort of indigenous religions. I think the first one to really point to how this, the BJP's electoral success in this part is the anthropologist Arkotung Longkumar. And he shows compellingly in his book, The Great Indian Experiment, Hindutva and the Northeast. This is a book that came out at Stanford last year. So he shows with great detail how the BJP or RSS have a well-planned intervention that subsequently led to this electoral success. So they've been running boarding schools. They've been really smart in the way they have sort of engaged in different coalitions with regional parties, and then eventually winning over state by state. So they are in power in a number of states now in the region. And I think, so this itself is really important, how the BJP have tried to turn this region that has been sort of unruly and set out from the different politics of India more generally, how they included that into sort of the general politics of India. But I think two things stands out here of greatest relevance for the Northeast, which also depends on the ongoing election, how these will continue to unfold. And the first of these is a new forest law that was enacted last year. And it's called the New Forest Conservation Law, of immense importance for Northeast. The second one is this large-scale rolling out of the oil palm project, where the government, in the name of increasing self-sufficiency in edible oil, are investing or giving a lot of incentives to people in Northeast to cultivate palm oil. So the government has sort of identified Northeast as the prime area for oil palm plantations. So I don't know how I'm doing in time now, but let me just try to rush through this a little bit. So in view so let me just then start with the first thing, the Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023. This is a highly contentious legislation that might come to change a lot in terms of how forests in India will be managed in the future. And I think in Northeast particularly, certain things stands out as extremely important. first of all, the new Land Amendment Act and the Forest Conservation Act states that only land forest that has been classified as forest, reserved forest, will be managed, and all other forests will be unclassed and hence not part of this new Amendment Act. And this is important in a lot of different ways because it opens up for the converting forest areas into plantations, for example. And the second important thing of the new act is it states that all areas within 100 kilometers from international borders will be open for infrastructure projects, different kinds of roads, railways, or all kinds of strategic linear projects of national importance, or having to do with national security can be important in these areas. And if you look at the map, basically all of Northeast India comes within this zone of 100 kilometers from international borders because it's also surrounded by borders. So it's just a minor part inside, in the middle of the green area that is not close to, 100 kilometers away from international borders. So basically, these two things together opens up for new types of colonization and land, claiming huge areas of land. And along with that, as I said, the BJP government has identified Northeast India as sort of the main site for oil palm plantations. And so with the new Forest Conservation Amendment Act, there is no restrictions in turning forest areas into plantations. So they have opened the paved the way for such investments. And secondly, it's along with that, they have given concessions to mainly two large companies, Patanjali Foods Limited and Godrej Agrobet. And these are companies that are very close to the BJP government. And the Patanjali, for example, is led by Baba Ramdev, who is sort of a well-known yoga guru who is very close to Prime Minister Modi. So what we see here, and Patanjali have also been given lands, in BJP ruled states at a very discounted price. So I think what we see here then is the possibility of a huge transformation of land use in the North and Eastern region. And I think palm oil is very interesting to think about, palm oil politics as we know it from other parts, from other scholars, like the work by Tanya Marie Lee and Sophie Chow in Indonesia, involves massive destruction of local subsistence systems as well as local environments. And in Indonesian case, the corporations have completely taken over the control through large scale, taking control over local lands through large-scale inflow of laborers from other parts of Indonesia, where the indigenous communities there now have been turned into sort of powerless or marginalized minorities. But in the Indonesian case, the military state or the state, the Indonesian state, have allotted huge tracts of land to these corporations. This is not the case in Northeast because, again, through these systems of protective land laws that are been in place since the post-colonial period, the oil palm corporations need to get individual farmers involved or interested in planting oil palm on the lands. And this has proven to be rather difficult. But the success instead seems to be with this indigenous elite that I mentioned earlier. These are, the ones that seems to be coming forward to are ready to plant oil palm. And I think this is interesting to think about why that is so, why these elite groups are interested in joining the oil palm and the possible consequences of that. I think, first of all, with the traditional land owning system in the hill areas, it is that, based on idea of shifting cultivation. So as long as somebody uses the land, nobody else can claim the land. And by planting, plantation crops as oil palm, it implies a permanent use of the land. So through oil palm and other such plantation crops, the the elites can sort of secure. Sorry, yeah. I'm just wrapping.
2 minutes, yeah.
2 minutes, yeah. So through wall palm, these elite groups can hence, lay claim on these, lands that they already appropriated. So they secure the land holdings. So here then, I'm thinking about how oil palm then as an ultimately political crop through which the central government can control this unruly North Asian region. So they can it might lead to the corporates taking control over areas in hand in glove with the elite, indigenous elite, and then possibly through new migrations of other, laborers into the area. It might again, lead into a very different sort of political scenario. So I'm really thinking here through the oil palm introduction that we might see a very different land dynamics emerging in the region. So yeah, thanks. I'm stopping there. So, but basically my argument is that oil palm in this part of India is not really about cooking oil, but it's really a lot about the central state asserting a new type of control over the region. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bengt. We'll carry on with the next presentation, I think, and which is Eric.
Thank you, Saba. I'll just share my screen. Okay, is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, so there were two broad questions, I think, from the organizers, and I'm going to try to respond to this first one. So how transitional and post-conflict dynamics impact upon access, ownership, and use of land? How does this impact ongoing processes of agrarian change? So my idea was for the next several minutes just to begin responding to that question by laying out some of the work we've been doing at the Center for Applied Human Rights around transitional and transformative justice, where transitional justice but also peace building more generally are often part of the transitional and post-conflict dynamics that shape to some degree what happens in those settings. So I'll begin offering an answer to this question, but I wanted to offer a slight modification if the organizers allow me. And the modification is to begin to turn this into a practice question as well. So the question is, how can we foster a politics or activism in transition that deals with the past and the present in all its complexity, and which positively impacts issues of access, ownership, and use of land and other resources for marginalized groups? I'm just going to move the PowerPoint forward. So that was the question I just read there. And I'm not sure it's a question anyone has an answer to yet, but what I hope to do is to set out some initial moorings, some opportunities that provide some future research and practice directions as well, certainly which I'm interested in, but which maybe some of those in the audience are as well. One thing I should say in advance is that incorporating questions of practice is very important for us at the Center for Applied Human Rights, or an activist center at the University of York, with a strong actor-oriented perspective on human rights. So that means starting with human rights actors, NGOs, movements, social movements, communities, what they can do to make rights real. And that means for our research, we're concerned to develop useful social scientific knowledge, either rooted in human rights practice or which might support or inform the work of practitioners and activists. So I very much make this presentation from that frame of mind. Okay, I'm going to move forward. So the first thing I wanted to do was to say a few things about transitional justice and peace building before kind of connecting to issues of land and resources. And my focus is particularly on transitional justice and issues that relate to justice. And my assumption here is that most of the audience is a development audience and will be perhaps less familiar with these fields than they will be with, for example, peasant studies, agrarian change, and so on. If I was talking to a transitional justice audience instead of a development audience, I might start from the other way around, but I'll do it this way around, and I hope that's okay. So transitional justice and peace building, as I said, they'll often form part of that post-conflict or post-authoritarian political context and its politics. And they're scholarly fields, but they're also practice fields. And the difference between the two, as they comprise sets of practices, is that essentially transitional justice is more narrowly focused on a core set of mechanisms for promoting justice, whereas peace building is much broader. And some say that transitional justice really falls under the umbrella of peace building. So what's transitional transitional justice. So essentially, it's a set of mechanisms, or it's a set of processes that are initiated after a period of conflict or a period of authoritarian government for dealing with the past. Transition societies will embark on state-based transitional justice measures, often under domestic pressure and possibly international pressure, to fulfill their duties under international law for dealing with the past. And for fulfilling these duties, they're assisted by international institutions, specialized international NGOs, practitioners and academics who provide technical support, advice. UN agencies like UNDP may provide technical support, funding, and so on. And it also represents a kind of global industry. And these transitional justice measures can be understood in terms of 5 themes or pillars, which I have here on the PowerPoint. So number 1, justice and prosecutions, which means putting perpetrators of serious human rights violations on trial, so punitive justice. Truth and truth seeking, which means trying to uncover the truth about what happened in the past, the truth about what happened during a period of conflict or repression. So for example, what happened to family members who disappeared and were never heard from again, what crimes were committed against civilians in occupied territories, who was responsible. And the main mechanism, the main transitional justice mechanism for uncovering the truth is the Truth Commission, which is a non-judicial body that seeks to provide a picture, a narrative of what happened, and that usually comes in the form of a final report with a set of recommendations to government for policy and so on. The most famous case, or one of the most famous cases, is the South Africa Truth Commission, which sort of went global in some ways and provided a model for other truth commissions elsewhere. So there's truth, there's reparations, which are efforts at some form of repair. So repair through the delivery of material or symbolic reparations to victims or survivors, or some combination of these, this idea of corrective justice. Guarantees of non-recurrence, which means trying to reform institutions, the police, judiciary, and so on, that were involved in some way in serious human rights violations. The idea, if you reform those institutions in a particular way, you can limit the prospects for violence recurring. And this last one, memorialization. So this is really the newest pillar of transitional justice, which is really about preserving and transmitting the memory of serious human rights violations. So in practice, that can look like museum exhibits, concerts, theatre, and so on. So those are the 5 pillars. And I've set these out as background here just for discussing some of the limitations of transitional justice and the demands this is putting to practice for forms of justice that are more transformative. And one of the things that I've been doing, my colleague as well at the Center for Applied Human Rights, Jose Guterres, he's doing the same thing, is to engage with these limitations and these demands through a rural and an agrarian lens. So the critique of transitional justice is multifaceted, but there were really 2 components I wanted to highlight. So the first is that transitional justice is very narrowly focused on civil and political rights violations and providing redress for acts of physical violence, torture, disappearance, and so on. It does comparatively little on matters of social and economic rights, issues of structural and systemic violence, marginalization, unemployment, and so on, that might be related, for example, to issues of access to lands, livelihoods, and so on. And in fact, there can be a mismatch between what a global industry and of transitional justice and those local domestic transitional justice processes prioritize and what communities prioritize. So there have been surveys and studies in transitional settings that have shown populations and victims can often, but not always, prioritize responses to economic and social issues. Okay, so for example, in Cambodia in 2009, I mean, this is just one example, there are many others. There was a survey conducted, a societal survey, after the prosecutions that occurred there. And the survey found actually 80% of people were prioritizing jobs, access to services. 75% thought it was more useful to focus on everyday problems rather than addressing the crimes of the past through prosecutions. Prosecutions are only mentioned in 2% of cases. So what this reveals, and as I say, there are other surveys, but it reveals a huge mismatch in priorities. And all of that is set within a larger political economy of liberal peace and state building. So this is the idea that the best way of securing peace within and between nations is by building democratic institutions and by creating market economies. And in the development sphere, that translates into demands to liberalize markets, privatize land, attract investment, increase formal economic activity. And the idea is that when that happens, peace comes to a troubled land. And what that sees in practice is interventions and activities in the development sphere that have not really departed far from Washington consensus prescriptions. So things you'll be familiar with: fiscal austerity, reducing the role of the state, promotion of the private sector, dismantling existing welfare systems, and so on. There may be a kind of clientelistic neoliberalism that emerges that reflects an elite bargaining in the economy, a unity between domestic elites, international actors around promoting private capital accumulation, weakening the labor force, minimizing the state's role in development, and so on. Now, transitional justice doesn't do all those things, but as it relates to matters of justice and injustice, questions linger about whether transitional justice has become the conscience of those things. So what we've tried to do at CAR, in a modest way, is to try to do some advocacy work directed towards the field of transitional justice around why the social and economic matter. And as I say, within that, my focus has been on the rural and the agrarian. So what I tried to do in an initial piece a few years ago, and Jose, my colleague Jose Gutierrez at the center, we turned this into an edited volume that focuses on Colombia. We wanted to highlight a couple of things, 4 things. Okay, so one is that to the transitional justice field. So one is that structural and systemic violence persists in societies that are transitioning away from conflict or repression. Peacetime is not commensurate with the end of rural violence. This is pushing what's called a positive peace perspective. So the idea that peace is not characterized merely by the absence of physical violence, but by successfully addressing the structural and the systemic as well. I mean, so Brazil is just one example where land inequalities, for instance, have persisted, but actually worsened during the democratic period. There has been land reform work, but it's been undermined by an agribusiness-friendly development model, which has been promoted by governments left and right. The second is that transitional and post-conflict settings, there may be sites of deep rural grievances and legacies of agrarian protest and conflict. So Professor Gana has talked about that today and has some excellent work papers that I've read where she talks about the deep tensions and grievances in the interior region of Tunisia that led to this demands for social justice, an explosion of demands for social justice, which in many ways remain unaddressed to this day. And in the background is agricultural restructuring, promotion of large-scale farming, neglect of small farmers and employment, and so on. Third, conflict and post-conflict settings may have large numbers of rural victims with that violence rooted in structures and processes of agrarian change. So, there's a lot of emerging work around this, mainly in Journal of Peasant Studies, Journal of Agrarian Studies. Kramer and Richards have an excellent special issue from 2011, where they talk about land conflict dynamics and drivers, including changes in access and control over land and labor, democratic pressures, land scarcity, among many other things. And there are good cases as well that have been emerging that have looked at these cases, empirical work. So Jan Selby, for example, who's looked at Syria, identifies the causal significance of the rise and fall of the government's oil rents model of agrarian development, and how that economic liberalization trajectory facilitated decline in agricultural jobs, government's decisions to remove subsidies on agricultural imports, and new rights for landowners to expel tenants. There are other cases too. Philip Verwimp has looked at rural differentiation in Rwanda, for example, in the build-up to the genocide. Again, most discussions of Rwanda will tend to focus on the ethnic dimension of violence, but class and ethnicity may track one another closely. And finally, rural grievances and social conflict are in a complex relationship with the rise of authoritarian populism and democratic backsliding globally. There's been a research agenda within the Emancipatory Rural Politics Initiative at the ISS in Rotterdam, which has produced many new case studies. Walden Bello, for example, has looked at the Philippines' poor record on agrarian reform as a reason for democratic backsliding there, for example. Mark Edelman has a great paper called Hollowed Out the Heartlands, which looks at the US and connects the rise of Trump with rural grievances there connected to economic restructuring, financialization, and so on over several decades. So those are the 4 components that relate to this first general limitation of transitional justice. the idea is, or the feeling is, transitional justice is continuing to address the symptoms of evil, but not its causes. The idea that the focus on civil and political rights, on physical violence, is far too narrow. There needs to be a much broader perspective that deals with the social and the economic. So I'm going to move to the next slide. So the second main limitation or critique is that participation by victims, by marginalized groups, by societies in general is very limited in transitional justice processes. So if you think of Arnstein's ladder of participation, transitional justice is probably, it is on the lower half of that ladder, okay? Transitional justice is mainly consultative. It tends to be limited to information sharing. The role of society really is to be spectators, and victims and marginalized groups will have very little role to play in shaping the design and the delivery of justice mechanisms, and to have their priorities reflected in justice agendas. And that includes rural-based organizations and movements that are kind of close to the pulse of the kinds of social and economic issues that I mentioned a moment ago. At present, there are few, actually, if any, opportunities for these actors to leverage justice processes, for example, to establish a narrative about what actually happened, to influence the direction of rural policy and programming, to raise fundamental questions about the choice of the economic model. And this is part of the politics of transition, which is why Simon Robbins, who's an associate at the Center for Applied Human Rights, has argued that transitional justice is a kind of an elite discourse. It's an elite justice, which essentially views transitions to democracy as processes generated and driven by elites. In other words, societal elites are the main actors, and change happens because of decisions made by elites. And if democracy emerges, it's because elites have been bargaining with one another, and also keeping certain agendas off the table. 5 minutes. Okay, I'm nearly done. Okay, so I've basically presented two problems, two challenges. As I said, the first is the neglect of the structural and the systemic, and the second is the limited scope for participation and influence, in this case, rural-based actors, organizations, and movements to shape justice processes and to represent marginalized groups and their priorities. So this is where we get to the practice question of what we can do, and there are some sub-questions, and these are questions of practice but also of research. So the first is, what challenges and opportunities are there? What positive developments can be highlighted? So one development is that there is a growing group now within the scholarly field of transitional justice, but also peace building, that are questioning these gaps, okay? So questioning, for example, the lack of focus on the systemic and the structural, asking questions about participation. And for that reason, the field looks quite different to what it was 15, 20 years ago. Some have said we're in a fourth generation of transitional justice, which is about questioning the assumptions of the field. And that provides opportunities, but challenges persist. So one of the obstacles that I've encountered engaging with transitional justice academics, when you talk about transformation, is they say, well, this stuff is very good, but it's pointless. Transitional justice mechanisms can't do all that stuff. How are you going to get elites to agree to all of this? And I think part of the problem, and it goes back to what I was saying before about a rights-based, actor-oriented perspective, part of the challenge is there's a kind of technical mentality here, that transitional justice is a matter of transitional justice entrepreneurs getting the institutions right. They're engaging with that question from a particular standpoint. And what Matthew Evans, who's an academic at Sussex, have done is we've tried to propose what we call a framework of practice for academics and practitioners in transformative justice, which lays out what we think the principles, values, and orientation of transformative justice is as a politics of justice. So emphasizing social change, having its roots in advocacy and activism, critical consciousness, empowerment, being theoretically plural, fostering collaboration with grassroots communities, and so on. Rural grassroots organizations and actors can be very adept at dealing with elites. So if you look at, for example, the prominent Latin American rural movements, they emerged during transitions to democracy to contest the way resources like land are distributed, and which placed them in direct confrontation with rural elites. It was social and economic, but political as well. So we think this would be a framework to engage with the younger generation of scholars and practitioners. Another possible opportunity, can transformative agrarian justice, can this serve as a useful framing tool for rural movements and organizations in their efforts to shape and influence justice and policy? One of the positive responses we've had so far from Colombia in relation to the book I mentioned, which was published in Spanish, is that has come from some agrarian movements who've said, you know, we've been doing transformative justice all along. The problem is we never had a vocabulary for saying so. So my question is, when we talk about transformative agrarian justice, can this provide a new vocabulary that can allow movements, organizations, activists, academics who are working with them to redescribe some of the good work that's going on? Can it assist organizations and movements creating new connections with justice actors and processes, or to engage in new ways? Can it facilitate their access to new sources of funding for justice-related projects? Another opportunity may be found in the passing of the General Assembly Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas. So this sets out, I'm sure you know, among other things, you know, right to seeds, right to food sovereignty, and so on. Can the content of the declaration be harnessed there as a useful normative framework in advocacy and activism? What existing transitional justice mechanisms can be leveraged? Okay, a positive development is that the Truth Commission, for example, Truth Commissions are starting to engage more with the social and economic. There may be opportunities to contribute to the narrative around the sources and causes of violence with an agrarian lens. One of the challenges is that the social and economic issues still, however, tend to be treated as kind of background information that provides the context for what are treated as more serious violations of civil and political rights and physical violence. The question is, can the structural and systemic be brought to the foreground? I think I'm probably slightly over time, so I'll just skip ahead slightly. And I'd just say the final point is, what opportunities could there be for creating informal systems of truth telling? So the Peasant Truth Commission in Brazil is a case in point of a recent civil society-based truth telling initiative that was designed to shed light on rural violence during the dictatorship period, which ended in the 1980s. It was led by a constellation of actors, academics, practitioners, rural organizations, and movements as a way of feeding into the findings of the formal Truth Commission. Can we create opportunities elsewhere, and which may go beyond the Peasant Truth Commission's focus to include the structural and systemic, and what advocacy activities can these prop up? So that's the end of the presentation. I've reformulated the question, and I hope that's made for a stimulating provocation. I think the key thing for me is, how can we foster a politics or an activism of justice around issues related to land, and which we can see as part of the political dynamics of the transition or post-conflict? I've just put up a couple of things here, just that come from our center, just some of the texts that I've referred to in this presentation by myself, but also colleagues in the center. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks so much to Eric and to the other presenters for their stimulating contributions to this panel. I just want to remind everyone that questions, if you have them, please put them in the Q&A box, and I'll moderate. I'm going to read out some questions, etc., as and when they come in. But I did want to start us off, because I've been thinking across these three papers that there are, you know, convergent themes and that make the papers speak to each other very nicely. And I have some questions that I wanted to direct. I'm sort of abusing my privilege as chair here to the three speakers. So I wanted to start with Alia. I mean, I was really fascinated with how you described the justification of land rights claims in the Tunisian context. In no small part because it resonates a lot with what I found in my own research on indigenous communities and various forms of rights-based mobilization in India. So the reference to ancestors, the mixed discourses, the hybrid discourses that tie together human rights, historical injustices that must be righted in the present, local identity, and so on and so forth. And you know, I wonder if you have some further thoughts on how that sort of pushes, if you will, the narrative frameworks within which we think about land rights in what we call hard places, beyond the liberal frame. And this obviously ties into to Eric's presentation, I think. I mean, the sort of the critique of transitional justice and the argument for a turn towards something that's transformative is one that really resonates, not, way beyond the agrarian and the rural, where I'm sitting in South Africa, in the sense that many of our current quandaries, flow from the fact that the transition process here was rather shallow for all its achievements, that it was very much tied up to very concrete human rights violations, civil and political rights, physical violence, as you say. So I'm wondering whether, when you encounter the kind of, the narratives that Alia, for example, has put on the table in front of us, if you see there in these movement discourses, in discourses that, very clearly transcend liberal frameworks, if you see resources there, right, for moving towards the kind of transformational justice that you're talking about. And I'm also, a brief point there. You raised the point about the objection. How do we get elites to agree? And isn't it increasingly the case that one has to answer to that you normally don't get elites to agree. You force them to concede. That this is ultimately about power and power equations, and that concessions come as a result of mobilization that brings about that kind of change. I mean, again, it's about recognizing the political aspect of this, and which is not, a sort of necessarily only about deliberation and moral persuasion, all the rest of it. And then finally, to Beth, it was great to hear you as always. And I mean, I had several thoughts there, but again, I wondered about firstly about what you told us about the new ways of inhabiting land that are coming into being, new ways of reasoning about how one lives on and with land in the context of Northeast India. If you feel that any of that resonates, perhaps with what you heard from Alia, with what you heard from Eric about, and I think that's the convergent theme here, that when we're talking about land rights in hard places, it's really about crafting imaginaries that go beyond state discourse, that go beyond liberal discourses, and so on and so forth. And I also wanted to ask you a sort of a very, very specific question, but obviously what you told us about palm oil cultivation and palm oil cultivation as a political tool, basically, for pacification. To me, that has deep colonial resonances. And I say that because of the region, again, where I've done my own work, Western Central India. When you go back and read the colonial archives, from after the end of the Anglo-Maratha Wars, 1818 onwards, there's an obsession among British colonial officials to do away with shifting cultivation and to promote sedentary agriculture. And the purposes of that are twofold. One is revenue generation, and the other one is pacification of basically what would be called tribal groups who constitute, an unruly challenge to imperial power. So I'm wondering if we're seeing a replay of processes that in the Indian context, Adivasi communities, indigenous communities know only all too well. So I wanted to put that sort of up for comment, discussion, conversation, and then we can ask our presenters to maybe present in turn, Alia, Bengt, and Eric, while the audience thinks of questions to put in the Q&A box. Alia, do you want to go first?
I think you have to unmute, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Nilsen, for your questions and issues that you raised. In fact, one of the things that struck me when interviewing the leaders of the association that is now in charge of the operation of the farm is this hybrid discourse, referring to very different references. I think discourses are very important to analyze. I'm not sure it's enough to say that we need to go beyond or transcend. We need to transcend the liberal framework and discourse. I think that one of the main problems I've had with this GEMNA experience, contrary to my other colleagues and researchers in Tunisia, is that I was very cautious to applaud and present it as a revolutionary example or a success story, because beyond the discourses and the narratives, you have also the facts. And I think this is something that we need to capture at the same time, because when I did the research, so I noticed that there were major problems because in fact the association doesn't really represent the farmers and the rural communities. They just they represent the elite of the town, and they are not really. I mean, one of the conclusions that I came up with is that they are not really interested in farming. They are not interested really in land, but occupying the land, and they're interested in the incomes that can be generated from the farm, and also another aspect is that I have been able to observe some very conflicting situations between the workers of the farm that are employed by the association and the leaders of the association. So this is to say that in this case, we are also in a situation whereby local elites have reappropriated or instrumentalized the claims and the demands of poor peasants and farm workers. So it's strong, but this is to say that it's very important to be able to capture both discourses and practices. And I'm not sure that keeping, having this narrative about the importance of local identity, the belonging to the community, the belonging to the southern region of Tunisia is something that goes, that is in line of with a project of social emancipation, especially when it comes to manage the demands of the farm, the workers of the farm, who were actually in favor of the creation of a cooperative, which the association didn't want, didn't accept, and instead justified its refusal by the fact that they give also social aids to the workers. So it's a very paternalistic work relation that is in fact in place. So those are the contradictions that maybe I wanted to also. So it's not so straightforward. I don't know actually what is beyond the liberal model. I don't know. So we need to, maybe this is something that we should think about collectively.
Thank you, Alia. Bette?
No, thanks, Alf. I always feel sort of anxious when I try to present what is going on in Northeast. I always feel that I've become too messy, but I hope this I managed to make myself reasonably clear. I think one of the things that I'm, listening also to Eric's presentation, I find it always difficult to translate what is going on in this particular, if you call it a hard place, but it's a quite messy place, and translate that into categories or concepts, just thinking about transformative transitional justice is very difficult in this context. But I think what I've sort of tried to say is that when you have a place that has been really marked by, ethnic movements, all the politics been sort of about ethnic homelands, and that has that politics produced a lot of violence, but then giving a space to these elite groups that to capture land. And I think now when they then introduce a central government that are pushing the Hindutva agenda in the Indian case, it becomes very complicated. And I think, the elite groups, they think they can, appropriate the central state for their own purposes. But I think it's the other, it's actually what we see happening is the other way around, how actually the Hindutva project is in a way entering in a very big way. So I think, so that is that, and that is happening now through oil palm. But I think it's very interesting to think about, that what kind of different crops are bringing along with them. And I think here oil palm brings, you need a lot of capital, you need a new technology, and you need access to markets. And this is provided through then these agro-industries, these companies that again, have relations with the central state. And I think so that process is very difficult to control. Put that in opposition to the food sovereignty projects. And I think here, Alf, you're really right about saying that what, if the oil palm really represent a colonial project, really, I think it's exactly in the same dynamic. And we could see that, I do some work on tea plantations, and I think the oil palm can be the new tea plant. But for the food sovereignty activists, and this is something that, as I said, I've been working with some colleagues, Dolly Kikon and some others. We've been following some of the organizations that try to promote, what they talk about as indigenous crops, crops like millets and some other ones that have that people have been planting all along. So it's part of, the ancestry in a way, you planted them, generations have touched them, replanted. So it's really part of the culture, and people know the seeds. So it's all in the control of the community. And for these crops, it's really about shifting cultivation. And it's also collective, you do it together, because you can't plant some of these crops alone, you do it collectively. And I think a lot of these food sovereignty organizations, they stress on shifting cultivation as central, and as more, in that way, democratic, and they also push the idea that actually it is more sustainable environmentally. And this is, of course, what the colonial and the post-colonial state has always been arguing, that shifting cultivation destroys forests, is a savage form of cultivation. But actually now with climate change, we see how it actually is a more adaptive form, when also a lot of these old crops are more resilient for, different, if it's not heavy rains, or so they are more climate resilient. So I think that is but again, these attempts to build on, agriculture practices and crops from the past is also, they have a very clear vision. And Ghanaian has said, try to develop relationship with the land, with also other living beings. So they use some of these ideas, that we know from indigenous movements about, closer to the nature. But I think it's the idea here is that you build sovereignty from within. So you don't focus only on borders and boundaries about ethnic land, homelands, but actually you develop a relationship with the land. So you build that sort of sovereignty from within. And I think this is something that we see happening also in other parts of the world. A lot of these indigenous food sovereignty activities are very similar in a lot of parts of the world. And again, stressing about indigenous food ways, as both more nutritious and more, So I think there is, but again, they are quite small. They are also, some of these movements have money from international organizations. So they are not financially self-sufficient at this moment. But I think, we hear a lot of these activists, food sovereignty activists, they say that, yeah, there is a lot of things conspiring against us because against, the central government, the palm oil scheme, they give farmers a lot of money in initiatives to actually plant oil palm. But so they say that we have a lot of forces against us, but we know that this is the right way. So I mean, I don't know exactly, but we see the glimmers of hope in these attempts, and it's quite inspiring because again, also in a hard place that has been marked by violent conflicts, this is a non-violent means of really asserting yourself, in having. So I personally really believe in this type of, I'm very much a supporter of these initiatives. Because it's also that nobody can be against growing your own food and become self-sufficient in food, and the food that you used to eat, and I think that is something that which I think is more speaks across other parts of the world. Yeah, a lot to say there, but thanks, Alf. I think you're really right about what you suggested there. Yeah.
Thanks, Pepe. Eric, would you like to round us off? We have about 5 minutes left of the session.
Yeah, I could say a few things. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, yes, it sounds, Bengt, the context you work in, I can't see transitional justice process being feasible anytime soon. There may be other ways of documenting the truth about what's going on, but until the situation changes, it sounds like it would be a very challenging one. I guess the comment you made, Alf, I think about elites. I mean, I think I agree entirely. I mean, the difference between getting elites to agree versus getting elites to concede. As I mentioned, I think there is a sense that when I engage with academics and practitioners in this field, there is a sense that it is about getting the institutions right. It's about persuading. It's about persuading people, and I think, I mean, I also understand, in part, I think I understand where it comes from, that when power is distributed in a particular way in a transitional context, and things could go in many different directions, there is a fear that something is put onto the agenda that provokes a backlash. It could lead to more powerful actors, whether it's the police, military, and so on, taking steps. So I can see where it comes from, but I still feel at the same time there are issues, important issues, structural and systemic, that need to be addressed, and there's this lack of agency. And nevertheless, we do have actors, not just rural actors, but many actors, movements, grassroots organizations, and so on, that are pressing already in many contexts for these around these demands that I mentioned. Was there a second question for me, Alf? I may have missed it.
I was just wondering about what you think about the sort of the resources that you might find, in the kind of insurgent or collective practices that both Bengt and Alia have been talking about for the kind of resource for building more expansive conceptions and projects of a more transformational form of justice, if you will. I'm wondering if when you look at the kind of collective mobilizations that are happening, if you see stuff there that sort of provides the stuff that transformational justice, if you want to call it that, might be made of or might built from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an empirical question, but I mean, I think a lot of, as I mentioned in the presentation, I think a lot of what, and in truth, the sort of the work I've done is more around the Latin American movements, but a lot of what those movements are doing connects in a very strong way with the kind of justice issues we're talking about here. So I am talking about the kinds of discourses around rights, around access to land, the kinds of, at a very local level, the kinds of memory projects that might be underway. Alia, Professor Gana, you mentioned how the case in Tunisia was a case of memory. I think there are the seeds of work around memory, around documentation of issues around human rights violations, an already existing repertoire potentially of contention, okay, occupations, more explicit forms of mobilization that might be harnessed. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, Alf, but
No, it does.
some
It does very
thoughts.
substantially so. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it brings us brilliantly also to full circle of our webinar. I think all that really remains for us to do is to thank the presenters for 3 very stimulating contributions, and also to thank those of you who have tuned in. Yeah, that brings us to the end basically, and just like to wish everyone a really nice afternoon. I'm going to assume that it's afternoonish in most places where people are, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.